Right, well, thank you all for coming tonight. It's so nice to be in this beautiful space as well, diving into the past to make sense of the present, I guess, and shine a light on the future. That's what we're celebrating tonight. And I'm just going to make a quick introduction for Dr. Nil Palabıyık. Dr. Nil Palabıyık is a lecturer in the medieval and early modern studies at Queen Mary University of London. Her research is at the crossroads of intellectual history, history of the book, and print culture and manuscript studies, focusing on the interactions between the Ottoman Empire and Europe in the early modern period. Her recent monograph, Silent Teachers, which came out with Routledge last April, considers the influence of Ottoman learned practices and reference tools on Oriental studies in early modern Europe through annotations, study notes, and correspondence. Nil has published widely in highly regarded academic journals, including the Library, International Journal of the Classical Tradition, and the Journal of American Oriental Study. While Nil's research is interdisciplinary, spanning over history, literature, and theology, her academic career has been as itinerant as some of the characters she studies. She was in Istanbul, York, and London for her studies, worked in Munich and Manchester before returning to London. Her love of manuscripts took her to the finest libraries in the world, from the well-known Bodleian in Oxford and the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, to more obscure ones such as the Bibliotheca Augusta in Wolfenbüttel and Bibliotheca Thyssinia in Leiden. Her research has earned Nil several awards and accolades. She was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow and a fellow of the Humboldt Foundation after her PhD. She has recently been named a Philip Leverhulme Prize winner, which, according to the Trust, recognizes and celebrates the achievements of outstanding academics whose work have already attracted international recognition and whose future careers are exceptionally promising. So I'm very excited to listen to your lecture today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Okay, yeah, a cool and clear morning in early June 1627 saw a large ship, the Royal Defence of London, steer into the busy port of Galata. After its 3-month-long journey, the English trade vessel had arrived at its final destination, Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Ottoman Empire. Can we get rid of us?
That would be from your computer.
Okay, exactly. Just like, because there's always text on
drag
it.
them to the corner.
That's fine.
Yeah. So here in the slide, you see a map of Istanbul from 1612. With its gleaming domes, graceful minarets, and medieval city walls, the Queen of the Cities lay in its full glory beyond the shimmering sea. Having navigated the perilous waters surrounding the Bosphorus Strait, now the ship had reached the entrance of the Golden Horn, a calm and inviting estuary. Here the sea stretched flat like a soft blue blanket, and small rowing boats with a double oar called terame in local parlance ferried people across the two sides lined with Greek, Jewish, Armenian, and Latin neighborhoods. The harbor and the surrounding waters were dotted with wooden ships, like you see in this nice map, of all sizes whose colorful sails fluttered in the wind. In its cargo bay, the Royal Defence held a rather curious piece of machinery, a printing press from London. It was unusual for a merchant ship to carry metal type fonts, reams of paper, and crates of printed pages across the seas. In this very moment, the owner of the equipment, one Nicodemus Metaxas, a Venetian Greek monk and book editor, dared to dream that this press and its output would change the fates, and fortunes of his oppressed folk forever. Father Nikos, as he was known to his friends, ascended the deck via a steep, creaking ladder. The fresh morning air made him almost forget the long journey, plagued by seasickness and the horrendous diet of biscuits, rind beef, and soggy English pickles that he had to endure. Father Nikos stroked his thick, jet-black beard and pondered for a moment, His long and elegant fingers were inked from tracing endless lines of accented and ligatured Greek on freshly printed pages during the long hours that he corrected text under the flickering candlelight. Even before he caught sight of the approaching shore, he knew what to expect. Before embarking on this journey, he had pored over the many depictions of the city in books, panoramas, cityscapes, maps quickly sketched by former visitors to the Ottoman capital on location, and perfected by master engravers in the Low Countries and Germany. Father Nikos' ancestors hailed from here. The Metaxas family came from a noble Byzantine line, but he had never been to Constantinople before. For the Greeks, the city was special for its churches, the most famous of which used to be the Hagia Sophia, a temple dedicated to holy wisdom, a terracotta-colored, geometrically perfect square structure with a circular dome, humble on the outside, but lavishly decorated inside with dainty mosaics and colorful icons depicting Virgin Mary, Jesus, and his disciples. This was now a mosque under the Ottomans, and the Sultan often took his Friday prayers there. There would be a huge and impressive parade en route, and the worshippers did not bat an eyelid to the fact that they prayed under Christian icons. They rather saw themselves as the continuation of a glorious Abrahamic tradition. Father Nikos was excited about seeing the Byzantine churches and the Patriarchate, the seat of the spiritual and administrative leader of the Orthodox faith. But he considered the city first and foremost as scholars' paradise, and yearned to visit the famous book markets, or the Sahaflar Çarşısı, where one found the most exquisite illuminated tomes. The Patriarchal Library was also home to the choicest Greek manuscripts from the antiquity and many ancient Christian treasures. His tawny cape filled and swelled with the sea breeze. He heard the gentle waves crashing against the ship. As the ship approached the lively promenade, where eager merchants in white turbans and black pilgrim hats haggled prices for the goods that had not even reached the shore, the 35-strong crew of Royal Defence caught sight of an old, imposing tower with a conic roof at the top of the hill. Once called the Christ's Tower by the resident Genoese community, the Galata Tower, an outstanding 14th century building, defined the skyline of the city's seafront. For Father Nikos, the Galata Tower was going to act as a compass, both as a geographical one, to orient himself towards the cosmopolitan neighborhood it presided over, Pera, and a moral one which reminded him of the many vices the narrow streets underneath the tower was home to: taverns, brothels, coffee houses, and other dens of ill fame, as described by Evliya Çelebi and others. What is the background of Father Nikos, and why is he traveling on an English merchant ship, you may ask? He was born Nicodemus Metaxas in 1585 in Cephalonia, in the Ionian Islands, to a wealthy Orthodox Greek family. He received his primary education from his uncle, a well-connected bishop of the Ionian Islands. Around 1615, Nikos went to Ottoman Athens to study with one of the leading Greek philosophers of the 17th century, Theophilos Korydallos. Korydallos, a neo-Aristotelian educator, was a graduate of the famous University of Padua. He was one of the most celebrated scholars of the Greek-speaking world at the time. He became the director of the Patriarchal Academy in Constantinople in 1627 and reformed the curriculum there. Korydallos wrote several textbooks which influenced Greek education for centuries. Two of these books were to be the first printed editions produced by Father Nikos in London in 1625. Here you see on the left Periepistolikon Typon, on the epistolary types, and on the right a rhetorical manual, both penned by Korydallos and printed in William Stansby's house in Crosskeys, and they bear his printer's device. His logo, basically. Here you see the first printed Greek epistolary manual, the first letter writing manual written in Greek. This became a standard textbook at the Patriarchal School in Constantinople immediately after its publication. The work's popularity continued in the Ottoman Balkans during the next 2 centuries. There are many reprints of this first edition, and there are manuscripts that copy the edition because printing was not very common in the Balkans at the time, so they engaged in manuscript production of a printed edition. So Father Nikos arrived in England in 1623 to join his merchant brother and to study divinity at Oxford, but he somehow found himself in London's Fleet Street, at the heart of the city's printed book trade. Father Nikos' brother, Jacob, was a merchant of the Levant Company, and he was already residing in London. Established by Queen Elizabeth I in the previous century, the Levant Company had become very active and profitable in the Eastern Mediterranean by the early 17th century. Here you see a map showing the vast territories of the Ottoman Empire, and a gold cup on the right with the Levant Company arms, a 3-masted ship on calm seas with a Latin motto. And you might ask, what was a Greek merchant from Cephalonia doing in London in early 17th century? There's one answer to that question: trading currants. Yes, a small and sweet black seedless dried grape variety is now perhaps a niche product, but back in the 17th century it was something of a sensation. Most of it was produced in the Ionian islands of Cephalonia, Zante, and Corfu, all overseas possessions of the Republic of Venice at the time. Before sugarcane from the New World colonies began flowing into the English ports in large quantities, sweet ingredients were still a luxury. The English, famous for their sweet tooth, were the biggest consumers of currants in Europe. It is well known that early modern English cooks added a handful or 2 of these tiny black raisins, not only to sweetmeats, as Shakespeare and his contemporaries called cakes, pastries, and confectionery, but also to pottage, pies, and puddings, even salads, if they could afford it. The consumers might have had the appetite for currants, but the officials, British officials, believed that this extravagance needed to be curbed. On December 26, 1621, the English ambassador in Constantinople and protector of Turkey merchants, Sir Thomas Roe, and we will come back to him, wrote a long report from Zante to George Calvert, Secretary of State, to complain about the excessive import and consumption of currants. And I quote from his letter: "You will think me busier than Chaucer's lawyer, that molest you with so many lines," wrote Roe apologetically. But Calvert had to be warned about the fact that Zante and Cephalonia made over 7 million Spanish reals out of currants, mostly thanks to the British traders. Britain bought 2/3 of the entire production with ready money, that is, hard cash, instead of barter for exported goods, which Britain had very few. And this created a significant deficit. This needless consumption of currants caused embarrassment. Roe argued, "People here think we cannot live without them, and therefore value them at gold. Yet others have thought we fed hogs with them, so great is the quantity above all Europe beside." So while Jacob traded currants, Father Nikos printed books like these ones. This is a volume of 3 tracts by Orthodox theologians. The collection opens with a lengthy and philosophical foreword, in which Father Nikos contemplates the importance of defending the truth, aletheia, in the face of all adversities and transmitting the true word of the scriptures and the teachings of the early church fathers. Towards the close of the dedication, he states that he printed tracts rendered in the common and vulgar language, koini ke hidaya gloti. Whenever possible, so that all Greeks would be able to read these texts, or at least follow them when they were read out loud. With this book, we witness the first seeds of a mini Greek Renaissance, with the establishment of a printing press publishing tracts in vernacular Greek, in Demotic Greek, for the first time in London, and later in Constantinople, thanks to Father Nikos' efforts. The tracts in this collection are two apodictic orations by Gregory Palamas, the Orthodox Refuge by George Scholarios, the first patriarch of Constantinople after the conquest by the Ottomans, and a dialogue between a Greek and a Latin by Maximus Margunios, one of the most important theologians and poets as well of this period of the 17th century. So all three tracts discuss the subject of the procession of the Holy Spirit and address the differences between the Greek and the Latin views regarding the filioque doctrine. The procession of the Holy Spirit was a major source of theological dispute between the Greeks and the Latins during this period, and these three authors laid the basis for future polemics on the subject. So this is about whether the Holy Spirit proceeds through the Son or with the Son. So the Greeks and Latins couldn't agree on this. What seems to us perhaps a minor point as a major point of contention. So the English capital does seem like an odd choice to print orthodox polemical tracts dealing with the doctrinal differences between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox tradition. But there was appetite for any text that criticized the papacy in post-Reformation England. Another volume Father Nikos printed in London was a collection of several tracts, epistles, and short pieces focusing on the other doctrinal issues that divided the two churches, such as the primacy of the Pope, purgatory, original sin, and the sacrament of the Eucharist. It almost seems Father Nikos purposefully brought together authors of opposing opinions in this collection. Varla, for instance, was condemned in the East for his writings against Palamas. He retired to Calabria and joined the Roman Church. And there was a long-standing dispute between Margunios and Severos concerning the filioque question. So you see that he brought together authors of opposing opinions. Despite the controversial nature of the topics, a rhetoric of moderation and restraint is observed in the tone and register of tracts, as in Varlam's On the Primacy of Pope, for instance. In the beginning of the book, he addresses Francis, a Latin Christian, and offers to outline their differences, and I quote, in a brotherly and friendly spirit. Adelphikos, Pekai Philikos. So, Father Nikos' editorial choices are indicative of his willingness to accommodate diversity, foster discussion, and celebrate the whole spectrum of Greek thought through his publications. 17th century England also saw the emergence of toleration and religious pluralism with an opposition to religious persecution. You might know this period as the Civil War and, a lot of violence and so on, but progressive writers of this period made a case for the peaceful coexistence within one society of a plurality of churches and religious. These ideas were very strong among a certain group of scholars. And Father Nikos was kind of in that group. he was close to that group. He wasn't part of it, but he was hanging out with them, let's say, while he was in London. So Father Nikos found this atmosphere of friendly dialogue and fruitful conversations in England very pleasurable and inspiring, as he took these very qualities with him to Constantinople. However, he did not find the local Christian communities there in Istanbul very receptive to this idea. So let's go back to our ship. At the quayside of Galata, 3 figures in clerical garbs were awaiting for their important arrival from the royal defense, the prized printing press, to start a small revolution. This is Patriarch Cyril Lucar, an influential and erudite man who oversaw the religious, administrative, and legal affairs of the populous Greek nation, the Greek millet of the Ottoman Empire. His many enemies called Cyril a heretic. His Protestant friends embraced him as a Calvinist, and history remembers him as the Protestant Patriarch due to a short confession published in Geneva in 1629 under his name. There's no agreement between scholars whether this is an authentic confession or not to this date. After a series of pro-Catholic patriarchs in the 17th century, Cyril had chosen to establish closer ties with the Protestant world. He was also keen to utilize the printing technology to disseminate religious and polemical literature, just like his peers in Western Europe. These revolutionary ideas made many enemies for the Patriarch. He had little support from his own church, which was very traditional. The Pope and the Propaganda Fide, the missionary arm of the Church, of the Roman Church, tasked with fostering the spread of Catholicism, especially in the East, were breathing down his neck. Cyril needed some supporters. He became friendly with the English ambassador Rowe, who had written to the Secretary of the State about the currents, and the Dutch resident Cornelis Haga, both of whom courted the Patriarch in order to lay their hands on the exquisite Greek manuscripts that lined the shelves of his matchless library. They were collecting books for their rich patrons at home. Rowe considered these volumes, and I quote, weapons fit for champions, end quote. And he tried to persuade Cyril by saying, these old books rot and rust by you among ignorant Greeks that will never understand nor make use of them. This was his opinion. Rowe's entitlement is clear in his belief, and he says that in right, these books belong to the Church of God. That is the Anglican Church, of course, that will publish them. Haga and Rowe were engaged in a friendly but fervent competition for Cyril's famed library. One by one, they moved the most valued codices from Constantinople. In 1627, Rowe secured for the bibliophile King James I the Codex Alexandrinus, one of the oldest Bibles in the world. Believed to be copied by an Egyptian female martyr named Thecla in the 5th century, it is now on permanent display at the British Library. As a representative of the newfound purchasing power of Western imperialism, Rowe also tried to obtain Byzantine reliefs from the famed Golden Gate, the Porta Aurea of Constantinople, by very questionable means. His plan was to smuggle out of the Ottoman Empire at least 4 slabs, including one depicting Hercules and a stag, dismissed by Rowe as depicting some story not mentioned in his labors, although this is clearly the sacred Cernaean hind. Hercules had to capture and release as part of his labors. And another was Rowe's favorite, and he describes it as such: an Endymion carelessly sleeping by his sheep, Luna descending from the sky with a torch in her hand representing light, and a Cupid hovering in the air to signify her love. So we certainly like this one. Once in England, these artifacts were to be divided between the Earl of Arundel and the Duke of Buckingham, two patrons that Rowe served as a side hustle to his official duties in Constantinople. Collecting for patrons was part and parcel of diplomatic life in the Ottoman Empire, but Rowe's methods in acquisition were quite extreme. He wrote to Buckingham, "Promise to obtain them, I cannot, because they stand upon the ancient gate, the most conspicuous of the city, being the entrance by the castle called Seven Towers." He means the Yedi Kule zindanları, as you see in the slide. Nobody dared to steal the slabs from such a prominent spot, obviously. And he said, to procure them by favor is more impossible. There is only then one way left, by corruption of some churchman, to dislike them as against their law, and under that pretense to take them down, to be brought into some private place, from whence, after the matter is cold and unsuspected, they may be conveyed, he wrote. This convoluted plan of Rowe's did not come to fruition, but he lost none of his misplaced self-confidence. Rowe claims to have purchased the marbles through the intermediary of the great treasurer, Defterdar Ebu Bekir Efendi, who agreed to have them taken down and delivered to the ambassador by boat for a hefty sum. However, according to Rowe, the local people were fervently against it, since they were superstitious, and believing that the ancient stones to be enchanted, they began to mutiny. After references to an old book of prophecy and an underground vault to make his story juicier, Rowe proudly concluded, "Though I could not get the stones, I almost raised an insurrection in that part of the city." The story of acquisition of classic art by Englishmen has never been pleasant reading, but something has to be said about the preposterousness of Rowe in aggrandizing his place within the Ottoman order. Luckily, some of the reliefs have survived in fragments, including this fine piece depicting Endymion's lover Selene descending from heavens, bearing a torch, as described in Rowe's report. See it there, the torch and her. And these fragments are now on permanent display at the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. This curious episode of Rowe trying to obtain artifacts by any means possible is not an exception. In these early years of sustained travel to the Ottoman Empire, European nobility and antique collectors scrambled to seize whatever they can: books, coins, seals, ancient Greek and Roman statues, busts, fossils, and the like. Craftiness, matched by an inflated sense of his own importance, made for annoying company for Rome. The patriarch and with him the Greek community was in the close of Rhodo, and Cyril became more and more dependent on the ambassador's advice. The patriarch's was a prominent position with many privileges from the Sultan, yet his resolve was weakened and his purse emptied by years and years of conflict with Rome and divisions within the Greek Church. Patriarch Cyril's career was marred by several depositions from his throne and the constant threat of death at the whim of a high-ranking Ottoman officer. His end by strangulation came in 1638. The dethronements did not only lead to a loss of authority and influence, but each one came with a financial burden. In the unstable climate of Ottoman politics, the dynamics changed rapidly as viziers came and went. During the 5 terms of Cyril between 1620 and 1638, the Ottoman port, the Sublime Port, saw 3 sultans and 17 grand viziers, while the gift and tax payments to the sultan, called Pishkesh and Maktu, respectively, were official obligations of the Patriarch. Numerous other payments in the form of gifts to the Grand Vizier and other high-ranking officials were also made. Opulence was the way to promote one's cause, and showering officials with extravagant gifts was a centuries-old tradition of the city. As Rowe commented, dollars are more weighty here than reasons. If Haga and Rowe, the English ambassador and the Dutch ambassador, were sort of friends of Cyril, he indeed had many enemies, both within the Greek community and without. The most ferocious of these enemies were from the Latin community of Galata, the resident Jesuit fathers. This is the church of Saint Benoit and the adjoining school. The complex had red brick walls and an internal portico topped with a rectangular tower, is depicted in this engraving. And as I say, this was where the Patriarch's staunchest enemies operated. Father Nikos would have recognized the Jesuit monastery by the inscription above its gate, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, underneath the letters IHS, standing for Iota, Eta, and Sigma, the first three letters of the name Jesus. The teachers here were French, but they instructed the local children in their native languages. Younger pupils were taught how to read and write in Greek and Italian. Maths and basic recitations, such as the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed would be said in Latin. In the later years, the curriculum spanned Latin and Greek grammar, rhetorics, logic, philosophy, and the sciences. The Jesuit college, famed for the quality of its education, was a popular choice for Constantinopolitan families of different confessions and backgrounds. Among the pupils were Latins, Roman Catholics, Greeks, and Armenians, different denominations, but even some Jews, some non-Christians as well. In 1610, 2 Greek Orthodox monks and a deacon were attending the lectures at the Jesuit college, much to the displeasure of the Patriarch. When things got out of control, Cyril resorted to an encyclical advising his flock to remove their children from the Jesuit schools for good. Cyril accused the French Jesuit fathers of luring Greek children into their educational establishments and then proselytizing them. The schools being inclusive and free of charge, such measures fell on deaf ears. The Jesuits, Cyril wrote in 1613 to a Dutch minister in The Hague, taking the opportunity, have laid the foundation for a plan for educating boys in Constantinople. And he commented, they're succeeding in it, like foxes among hens. The Jesuits were protected by the French ambassador, Philip de Harlay, the Count of Cézy, and a devout Catholic from a famous family of Huguenots. De Harlay, who lived in Constantinople between 1620 and 39, proved himself the enemy of both Patriarch Cyril and the English ambassador Rowe. The French claimed precedence over all other European powers due to the capitulations conferred to them by the Ottomans. These capitulations granted French merchants security of people and goods in exchange for the payment of a customs fee. De Harlay was confident that he had the upper hand against the English ambassador, whom he often deridingly called a merchant in public, because he was a nobleman and Rowe, according to him, wasn't. As he reported in his partially ciphered letter to King Louis XIII during a visit to the Grand Vizier's residence, de Harlay was offered a chair, une chaise, whereas the English and Dutch ambassadors had to contend with stools, tabourets, which proved to be, to the pompous man, his superior status among all other diplomats. Rowe was wary of de Harlay's fastidiousness and hair-splitting formalities, and complained to a colleague, The Harley stands upon great puntos and had lost by it with me. He didn't like it at all. So Father Nikos, the humble savior of the Greek millet, the man who was going to make Cyril's dream come true, disembarked the ship, leaving his precious cargo behind, not quite knowing where he was going. Although he had navigated the world of the Anglican Church and English academia during his visits to Oxford, Cambridge, and London, with the recommendation letters, official letters from the Patriarch, this was the first time the two men met in person. Cyril was a tall man with a long white beard, you had seen him before, yeah, ruddy cheeks and a kind face. And Nikos was a man equally invested in God and worldly possessions. It was true that he was a bookish fellow, an editor of Greek books on rhetoric and theology with a keen eye and a knowledgeable clergyman. But he was also an ambitious individual with a boldness rarely seen in his profession, a man brave enough to risk his noble family's fortune on a charitable printing venture. In his head, he was ready to start the job. He could not wait one more moment to set up his printing press and start producing books. But Ottoman bureaucracy was excruciatingly slow, especially for foreigners who had to use non-direct channels allocated to them for communication with the Sublime Porte. Cyril and Father Nikos sought the help of the English ambassador Rowe, who agreed to unload the printing materials and take them through customs under the privileges of the Levant Company. At first, Father Nikos feared that he would not be allowed to print. Despite the feigned averseness of the Ottomans to the technology of movable type that Western historians are so keen to emphasize, the city of Constantinople was no stranger to printing. The Jews had already established several successful printing houses by the time Father Nikos had brought his own. In fact, the history of Hebrew printing in the empire went as back as the late 15th century, boasting at least one impugnable, datable to 1493. Those who were close to the court and the Ottoman establishment, including the personal physician to Sultan Süleyman, Moses Hamon, and the sought-after jewelry and luxury goods provider to the harem, Esther Kira, were prominent patrons of Hebrew book production. So this myth of Ottomans being against printing is a bit, it's on shaky ground really. Armenians also had their own printing houses. So the Greeks also obtained permission to print from the Ottoman authorities. Rowe bragged in a letter to his superiors that he obtained a special license from the Grand Vizier, but there's no evidence of that in the archives. There's no such record of Rowe obtaining such a document. Besides, while seemingly supporting Cyril and Greek publishing efforts, Rowe was not entirely happy about Father Nikos's arrival. The presence of a printing press, a means to distribute knowledge freely, at the hands of the Patriarch could shift the balance of power and prevent him from obtaining priceless manuscripts he pilfered with promises of future publication in England. A letter he wrote to Thomas Gold, chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, reads, "The press may hinder the Patriarch's purposes to furnish me, which were grounded upon a desire to cause many unknown authors to be printed, and take the light from under the bushel of ignorance and obscurity. I know their copies will never have credit, nor, I doubt, truth. Himself cannot see it all, and few other are able or fit to be trusted. And my opinion is that it may hinder me for a time, and lose the opportunity which I have opened, but never take effect, but lie by for a curiosity, like the great clock sent to Grand Signior, which went 24 hours, but stands up for a monument." So he's talking about the famous clock that was bought by Thomas Dallin. It was a present from Elizabeth I to Mehmet III. It was sent in 1599, and it was like an organ clock that operated with some water, and it never worked basically. They were never able to operated in on location. Well-known story. So Cyril wanted the press to operate under the auspices of the English embassy, but Rome was against it, as it would seem inappropriate. Soon after, a house was found somewhere between the English embassy and the French embassy in Pera, in the neighborhood close to today's Galatasaray High School, at the junction between İstiklal Caddesi and Yeni Çarşı. So this was both the residential and business quarters for the printer. In September 1627, Father Nikos began operating the press. One of the first tracts he printed and published was a treatise by the Patriarch himself, entitled Against the Jews, Kata Judeon. The title has anti-Semitic undertones, but it is in fact a tract that defends the Orthodox doctrine against Jewish writings. So it's not an anti-Semitic, it's theological in nature. A friend of Cyril's, George of Parga, as you will see from the title page, suggested that Cyril writes a tract in vernacular Greek delineating the conceptual commonalities and differences between the Jewish and the Christian tradition. And Cyril stated in the preface to the book that he provided the arguments which George would, and I quote, need in his daily and frequent conversations with his Jewish friends. So this is the premise. Promise and premise. The printing of this volume, which also contains the homilies of Maximus Margunius, known for his anti-Roman views, was completed in November 1627. So it took about a month to complete the copying, editing, typesetting, proofreading, and press work of two books that were bound together and published as a single volume. The Jesuits were disturbed by this publication. According to Rowe's account, they began first coercing Father Nikos to stop printing and then started threatening him. By the time he began printing what was to be the last book he ever published, A Confession of Faith by Patriarch Cyril, this was December 1627, our printer was so scared that he began staying at the English embassy rather than this rented quarters overnight and having a companion with him at all times during the day. He was very scared. Meanwhile, the Jesuit fathers have scrutinized the text of Bucharest's Against the Jews and found some remarks denigrating Prophet Muhammad. It was alleged that he was printing blasphemous texts insulting Islam. The French ambassador, Philippe de Harlay, relayed the accusations to Sadaret Kaymakamı, the deputy vizier, Recep Pasha, via the former governor of Galata, Ibrahim Ağa. A group of Janissaries were ordered by the Grand Vizier, Damat Halil Pasha, on 4th of January 1627 to break into Father Nikos's workshop, catch the printer in action, and confiscate his equipment. But Rowe had organized a party on Sunday, 6th of January, 1628, marking the feast of Epiphany. There was going to be a performance of an English mass, a big feast, and Cyril and other local guests, high-ranking Christians, were invited to this big festive event. Being Rowe's political opponent and personal enemy, de Harlay, the French ambassador, vindictively suggested a twist to the original plan of the Ottoman officials, that the attack should be deferred until Sunday to, and I quote, make sauce to the feast. On that very Sunday at noon, the Janissaries raided Father Nikos's workshop, confiscated his books, press and printing equipment, including typefaces and paper, and arrested the workmen. These were two Flemish workmen who came on the same ship with Nikos. So at the same time, Nikos was climbing the hill that stretched from Galata to Pera, where his printing house was located. Reportedly, he was wearing a hat, which helped him to pass through the guarded passages incognito. And he was able to slip into the English ambassador's residence, which was in the same area in Tepedoşe today, Rowe decided not to interrupt the entertainment, but to go ahead with the feast, and that Father Nikos stayed in his residence until the dust settled. The next day, the printed edition of Against the Jews was examined by Kaymakam Recep Pasha and Kazasker, military judge Hasan Efendi. According to Cyril's hastily written notes, and these notes are in Italian, they ordered a Greek chavush, a janissary captain, who had recently converted to Islam, to interpret the contents of the book. The Greek renegade said that the book was about the Jews and blasphemed in the way Christians blasphemed. Biastema come biastemano ni cristiani, wrote Patriarch Cyril. So Cyril requested the release of workmen, and Recep Pasha assured him that they would release them the following day. Ibrahim Al, the Jesuit intermediary, ordered a more thorough inspection of the text, but to no avail, nothing offensive could be found. When the vizier solicited the Mufti's opinion, he remarked, this is not very reliable because it comes from an English source, not from an Ottoman source, but the Shaykhul Islam allegedly said, dogmas contrary to the precepts of Muhammad are not on that account necessarily blasphemous or criminal, since Christians are permitted by the Sultan to profess their doctrines. There can be no harm in writing than in preaching in their defense. It is not simple belief, but an overt act which renders men immutable to laws. Very modern. By 8th of March, the investigation had ended and the press had been returned to its rightful owner. Disillusioned, Father Nikos decided not to print in Constantinople ever again, and soon returned to his native island of Cephalonia. Cyril created a bishopric of the three islands, and Father Nikos ascended the throne. So he was promoted from a priest monk to a bishop. A section denigrating Prophet Muhammad had previously been identified by the Jesuits. These were the allegations. And indeed, Cyril's Against the Jews did declare and condemn the opinions of the Turks, as Rowe also accepted. So this just, like, there's some inconsistency in there, right? So I went to the manuscript sources, and I was able to identify the passage in question in two of the extant manuscript codices in the British Library. So how was it possible that the Ottomans were not offended in the slightest by this blasphemous text? Would Ottoman tolerance stretch as far as allowing Father Nikos to print and disseminate anti-Islamic books in the Sultan's territory? Perhaps not. It was Nikos's editorial initiative that saved the day. The textual collation of the manuscript sources and the printed edition reveals that this section was considerably revised in the printed text. The passage our printer rewrote is a question-answer set dealing with forced conversions to Islam by Muhammad and his followers. Father Nikos adapted both the Jewish layperson's question and Cyril's reply so that the argument applies to all cases where religious conversion is imposed by nature. Muhammad's name and all the negative comments associated with his person, namely that he was a misguided man and a most insane corrupter of truth, and references to his wickedness, poniria, and cunning, dolus, were expunged from the printed version. I also observed in the Houghton copy in Princeton University, here on the right, that on page 16, the compositor had to insert an unusually generous line spacing above and below the question by the Jewish interlocutor to make up for expunged words and corresponding sorts. Maybe an explanation is necessary here. When printed books are produced, there is a manuscript copy specifically for this purpose, and the compositor puts lines between the page breaks, just like we have in Word today. So when they first marked the manuscript. There must have been a longer text there, and they were now that Nikos has changed the text, they had to add some empty spaces to make up for that lack of text there, like the shorter text. So to make up for the expunged words and the corresponding sorts. All the evidence suggests that the manuscript Father Nikos was given included the derogatory remarks, but the text was amended during the printing process. Was it merely the prudence that he removed all references to Muhammad in a book that he intended to print in the capital city of a predominantly Islamic empire? And why did our printer rework this passage and gave it a whole new meaning when he could have simply removed the reference to Muhammad or masked these uncomfortable judgments by discreet language? There was no official body or institution comparable to those in the West that would monitor and censor printed books before they reached the markets in the Ottoman Empire during this period. So no official censorship mechanism. Ottoman officials granted Father Nikos permission to print on his arrival, and it was not until the Jesuits had lodged a complaint that their attention was drawn to the contents of his books. They were simply not interested. Furthermore, the Mufti gave his unequivocal affirmation, if it's true, of the Christian community's basic rights to preach and disseminate in writing the tenets of their faith. All these suggest that fear of penalty may not have been the only reason why Father Nikos chose to censor this text. In the reworked passage, he did away with populist discourse and ritualic language and put emphasis on the horrors of religious oppression in general. He condemned whomever might try to force nations to convert, and I quote, by the sword and other means, and not with love, counsel, and miracles. Thanks to an acute change of tone and register, this new version of the passage serves to create an intelligent and sensible discussion, as opposed to the black and white simplification of right and wrong, of good and evil in the original passage. Father Nikos' inclination towards a rhetoric of moderation in Christian writing is natural given his previous record of publications and the pluralist sentiments of his circle of learned friends in England. In the multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan city of Constantinople, in which he had recently arrived, Father Nikos tried, albeit failed, to forge a platform for open dialogue and meaningful exchange of ideas between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. He did not find the atmosphere of religious tolerance he experienced before. Interconfessional tensions were high in the Ottoman capital, and these tracts delineating the differences between the doctrine of the Eastern Rite versus others were far too much to digest for the local communities. One of the first experiments with printing and pamphlet culture in the Ottoman Empire failed due to Christian polemics, political, commercial, and diplomatic rivalries between European powers on Ottoman soil. As expressed in a preface, Father Nikos had an ulterior motive in publishing, that is to promote the truth, if it is ever to be found. And he was aware that this was no light-hearted quest. His journey was full of traps, snares, and hurdles. Father Nikos risked his career as a priest monk, his family's finances, even his life, in order to improve Greek scholarship and the education of the Greek people in the Ottoman Empire. He believed he carried a formidable responsibility. He considered himself among, and I quote from this preface, those who have been entrusted with the people's faith and many other crucial things, as he quoted from Homer's Iliad. Finally, that burden felt too much to bear.
Dr. Nil Palabıyık, thank you so much for that speech. That was a real talk. That was great. Could we get the participants on Zoom? Can we see them as well? So maybe when we're asking if we open the floor to questions, like we can see them. Is that
chat?
Yeah, you can also
we-
bring
maybe-
the screen. Yeah, drag it up. There we go.
Okay.
Hello, friends. There we go. Yeah, there's some more, so you can drag it over. Oops, no, it's not. Okay. I think we pressed the wrong button. It should be like a multiple box.
This is the multiple one.
If their camera's not on, maybe they.
Oh yeah,
that's why.
exactly. That's true. If the cameras are on, then we can't see them.
Maybe
But if
because
anyone
I
wants to ask any questions, please
Well,
unmute
yes.
yourselves
Yeah,
and.
ask.
Oh yeah, now.
There we go.
Please unmute yourselves and ask. And if you can maybe make a brief introduction of who you are, that's also, that helps us familiarize ourselves with each other.
Well, of course, we can ask questions as well.
We can ask
we don't have to dump everything on the Zoom people.
Oh my God, exactly.
We exist.
Yeah.
Don't need to do questions, comments.
So I'm interested in the Jewish and Armenian printing houses. So did they have to get any sultan's permission, or was the millet system so strong that they could just do their own thing without asking for permission?
In the Hebrew case, I think the case was well beyond asking for permission. People who officially worked in the palace were patrons of production. They were financially backing the printing and dissemination of books. So if you are the physician, the personal physician to the Sultan, are you going to, seek permission from the vizier to produce a book, to become a sponsor for a publication? I think this is just like the way the hierarchy of the Ottoman order worked, and those people who were involved in at least the Hebrew book trade in Constantinople, which was the most famous, I think, kind of tradition of printing. It was among the Jews. The Armenians printed as well, but Jews had several presses at the same time, and they produced hundreds of books. And they also produced editions that made their way to Europe and were sold there. So I think it is better to kind of talk over from the Jewish book production perspective. And books on printing history do mention printing licenses and publication, and also selling licenses or trade licenses of books. So there were some licenses, but I think they were on an ad hoc basis. There wasn't like a certain authority that kind of dispensed them. They were just obtained by the printer probably when they first arrived, and were good for the rest.
So, and there was no censorship in the modern understanding of the term. Therefore, Constantinople was almost like a beacon of publication without the kings or the rulers imposing restrictions. Would that be
So there wasn't anything comparable to the Stationers' Company in Britain, for instance. There wasn't a regulating body that licensed each publication.
Mm-hmm.
But there must have been some internal mechanisms within the communities where they decided, this is permissible or not. But this is a case in point. The Ottoman authorities had no interest in Father Nikos's business until a complaint was lodged in.
a malicious complaint? Yeah.
A complaint that had some truth in it, in a way. There was that text that they laid their hands on, the Jesuits. They saw evidence of a passage perhaps denigrating Islam. but then was never printed, so no crime was committed.
I'm really interested in this is far later than I'm used to, but the practice of copying manuscripts from printed texts. Was that widespread, and for how long?
In the Balkans, it was widespread. There's kind of in the monastic libraries in that region, you do see. For me, it was very strange because they slavishly even reproduce the printing ornaments that are found in the book, in the manuscript. It's very funny. It's just that I had not seen it working in that way. I would always think a manuscript is turned into a printed edition. I was not aware of it, but this is a phenomenon in the Balkans, in the Ottoman Balkans, because there were presses, I think, in Yasi, and a few other places, but this is a vast area with lots of need for textbooks in many monasteries, many Christian Orthodox establishments, and they did not have a production line that fed those channels. And this book is not the only one that was reproduced in manuscript. Well, there's even a name for it, I can't remember. It's German term, there's a German term for it. Sorry, it's escaping me.
In the Patriarch Library in Fenner, I mean, are these books still there to be seen?
No, unfortunately, of course, I've been there. And they do have 2 copies of the tracts that I've shown you, but they don't have an entire set. And they certainly do not have any manuscripts from this era. So if the production copies of these editions were kept, they did not survive, or maybe they're kept elsewhere in the world, but they're not at the Patriarchal Library or any of the local libraries in Istanbul and Halki and so on.
Interesting. And the Greek?
I had very much hoped that I would find.
And the Jewish books, is there like a central place in Istanbul where there's this old collection, or again, is it dispersed around the world? Do you know much about that?
The incunable that I mentioned from 1493, one of the first books that were printed by the Soncinos, there's only one copy, and that's in the British Library. But I am not an expert on Hebrew.
Sure.
I was only researching it in the context of the background to the Greek press. But Hebrew is very elementary.
And you can read the Greek, the old Greek yourself, or do you need like translators to help you out?
No, of course I've read.
But presumably
my Greek teacher is here.
Oh, okay.
I hope you're proud.
Well, presumably that Greek is quite different to today's Greek, isn't it?
It depends, because one of these was in a sort of vernacular Greek, so it's very close to the modern Greek.
Okay.
The body of the language is the same. And one of the titles said that this is written in vernacular Greek, so it means it was quite easy, at least at that period of time. Educated Greek were able to read, but of course the majority of the population didn't have education after a period of time, because there were no proper schools, Greek schools. And
what was the Greek that they speak? What was that called? So it's not
Koine. It is the common Greek, because it was the Greek of the time of Alexander the Great, because he tried to unite the dialects, different dialects, because we have for the first time an empire. So it's called Koine, the common Greek, and it was based on the Attic dialect, because the most famous works were written in the Attic dialect, Plato, Aristotle, and all this. So, but it's something they were able to understand.
And what's vernacular Greek based on?
Or classical Greek,
Classical
it's the
Greek.
same language, but of course the language comes through changes, but the body of the language is the same.
Yeah.
The vocabulary at least is the same, but of course there are changes in terms of grammar, some structures, but the body is the same. So, and of course it's why the New Testament was written in the so-called Koine, Common Greek, because in the East, although we have the Romans, the lingua franca was still Greek.
Yeah, they call it by several names in these tracts. They call it Apni and Basic and Longer and Koine most of the time. But they also call it Basic Greek, so that people understand it. And there's also this expression in one of the prefaces that even if people are illiterate, even if they can't read them, these can be read out loud in schools and in churches, and so on and so forth. So there's this idea that common people, lay people, would understand this language.
Yeah. Was the printing press taken to Kefalonia?
If it, according to documents, it was taken there, but it is doubtful if it ever operated there and printed anything. There is one small tract on a local saint, Saint Gerasimus. There's a monastery dedicated to him in Cephalonia, and there's that tract which looks very similar to these tracts, and that could be one book that was produced there, but there's no other. So if there was production there, that was also very limited, just like in Constantinople, 3/4 tracts were produced there. I mean, so much Krakow for such little gain. But
Of course, it's a small world, Kefalonia, so if you do produce something, who's going to read it type thing, I suppose.
other than locals, yeah. And the nature of the production is also, of the text is also local. It's about the local saint, and it's about the opinions of certain churchmen on this saint's importance and so on.
Because probably we have the Venetians, and they had the ability to print their own books, because Kefalonia was never under Ottoman occupation, Ottoman rule, so the situation with the Ionian Islands were completely different. And in any case, they were more sophisticated, more educated, because the Venetian rule was different from many aspects from the Ottoman. So the situation there, the cultural.
Yeah, the
was
Venetians,
different.
as a republic, they wanted to have a balanced approach to Latin Christianity and other denominations under Venetian rule. But the Provveditore, the local governor of Cephalonia, there are reports that Father Nikos goes there with the printing press, and this is immediately reported back to central authorities in Venice. So there was this culture of surveillance quite a lot. So I mean, they didn't know what was happening. It was so much like the Ottoman Empire, where nobody noticed Father Nikos coming and unloading goods and whatever. I mean, there seems to be more like a reporting culture there of surveillance, and the Provveditore, the local governor, was immediately aware that a printing press had arrived and might start.
And that was dangerous. That was.
It was something that he found worth reporting to the Senate.
But of course, the Venetian empire, was it shrinking at the time? Was there this fear that,
the importance of the Venetian Republic for the Eastern Mediterranean was vanishing, the trade importance, the political importance.
Right. So maybe there was a fear that printing might bring Greek independence ideas, perhaps. Who knows?
Maybe it's too early for that.
Or am I jumping a whole century? Is that a different era altogether?
Well, I think there is a relationship between the common language, the local language, and vernacular languages, the rise of vernacular languages, and in a way, rise of nationalism. But Greek nationalism didn't work like that, right? They liked to cut their ribs. They wanted to go back to ancient conventions.
But I mean, obviously, there's Ionian Islands was like a little nursery of Greek culture beyond Ottoman control. So presumably they, as you indicated, they were more educated.
Because it was a very good combination. They had a sort of Italian and Greek education at the same time. And the Venetians allow a sort of renaissance on the Ionian Islands or on the island of Crete. And because Crete was for a long period of time under the Venetian rule. So the Venetian rule was different than the Ottoman rule. So we have within this place is a sort of renaissance. And of course the Venetians were aware of manuscripts because at the time of the fall of Constantinople, or even before, many Greek scholars found a sort of they went as refugees, let me say, to Venice and other places, and with them they had a suitcase full of manuscripts. And of course, everybody knows that they helped with the Italian Renaissance, European and mainly Italian Renaissance. So the Venetians were very aware of the culture, and of course they had all these manuscripts that Byzantine scholars brought with them at the time of the fall, and of course before, because they knew it was a matter of a year or 2 years. So.
Yeah, even under Ottomans, probably due to this heritage of, previous Venetian rule, Crete was much more cultivated for the Greek communities. Cyril Lucrez was native of Crete, of Candia, and he had many supporters from Crete, so there seems to be like this idea there of opening up the Orthodox religion to less traditional influences. So there's this Cretan school, not only in painting, but also Orthodox thought.
Would you go so far to say that this was like a reform, a type of Protestant reform through printing and allowing for dialogue, both internal within the Orthodox Church and also with other Christian faiths, to, shall we say, to change the old ways?
Yeah, I mean, the first translation of the New Testament into modern Greek was also done under Lucrez, and in the same period so there was this idea which is parallel to the Protestant and Lutheran idea of making the scripture available to the lay people in their own language.
And I'm sure there was some backlash as well by traditionalists who didn't like the idea of open debate.
But that's why he had so many enemies.
Sure.
But I mean, I wouldn't go so far, because I always call it a mini Renaissance. I don't think it's something that flourished enough. But
you called it a failure, effectively. I mean,
the printing press, I think, is not a success story.
Right.
But it fails not because of Ottoman oppression or averseness to printing. I mean, because when I say, it didn't happen, people always think, it must have been kind of confiscated by the Ottomans and so on. And so, I mean, it's more nuanced than
right.
They do confiscate it, but yeah. And Roll describes this turquesco, like in the Turkish manner. But so they were kind of, I don't know, hot-blooded in a way. But the source of the complaint is another Christian denomination, after all.
A result of international rivalries really between the French and the British ultimately.
And obviously, I mean, I couldn't put everything in this paper, but there's also a battle of the books between the Jesuits and the Greeks at that time. The Jesuits, the Roman Church published in Demotic Greek, in vernacular Greek, many books that carried the Catholic doctrine as well, and they were distributed. So you have Greek Orthodox polemical texts, and then you have Roman Catholic polemical texts, all in vernacular Greek, all to entice the Greek millet into reading whatever denomination they would feel.
Well, they did create also a Greek Catholic Church in Constantinople, didn't they? Through that propaganda, perhaps you can call it. So the Greek-speaking Catholics emperor.
Yeah, I don't want to take sides.
No, I'm just saying. I mean, obviously, it had some influence, clearly, because
the Jesuit school was very influential, and it wasn't just a school; it was also a cultural center. It had a library, they had theater, they had mystery plays, all things that were attractive to the local communities. I mean, and then within that there is a little bit of indoctrination as a side dish.
Do we have any questions from our Zoom friends? Speak up. If you have any questions, please.
I thought it was quite funny that Sir Thomas Roe wanted to ban red currants like a day after Christmas. He waited. He just couldn't wait too long.
I'm sure he had a sweet tooth. Just wanted more for himself. Do we have a chat? I think somebody was leaving. Many thanks. Okay. There we go. Okay. I think we should close the session.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you very much. Thank you.
So we get some time.